Hey friends, and welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is our first of several lectures on the book of Job. We'll focus in this lecture in providing a basic overview of the book of Job and then focusing on the first 10 chapters of the book of Job. The book of Job is probably one of the more difficult or perplexing books in the Hebrew Bible. It is a book that is memorable, and one that if you've ever read it or if you've ever heard a sermon preached on it, it will probably stick with you. But it is one that requires a good amount of wrestling with the text. The book of Job is 42 chapters in length. We know very little about its author or even its exact date of writing. Scholars suggest that the book of Job was probably written sometime between the 7th century BCE and the 4th century BCE. So that would be late in the Persian period. That would be in the Persian period or into the Hellenistic period. So when the time when Persia was in control of the ancient Near Eastern world, or perhaps when the Greeks, the Hellenistic period, had begun. It's very likely, though, that parts of Job are much older than that. And scholars have noticed that elements of the book of Job connect with much older traditions from other countries or regions of the ancient Near Eastern world. The Hebrew of Job is quite difficult, and it's often has some words that occur nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, and that requires scholars to do all sorts of interpretive work. I'll say more about this, but there is a narrative frame, which is the first 2 chapters of Job and the final chapter of Job. And this is written in prose. It is written in non-lyrical or non-poetic way, is the way I would say it. And it is sort of like a once upon a time sort of feel. It has what Terence Fretheim calls a dramatic fiction. It's set in an unknown period of time in an unidentifiable land called Uz. And so it's got this sense of being that the narrative frame creates this story that is almost ahistorical. It's almost it sets the story up in such a way that the historical particularities are not as important as the drama that's going to unfold. And so scholars have suggested that this narrative frame, again, chapters 1 through 2 and chapter 42, perhaps are older than the material in the middle, which is poetic in form, and it consists of a number of dialogues between Job and his friends, and eventually between Job and God. One of the major themes in the book of Job, this will come as no surprise if you're familiar with it, is suffering. Job's suffering in particular, and Job's experience of suffering that is not directly caused by anything that he has done, evil or wrong, but is suffering brought about by the nature of the world. Fretheim says that it is evil caused by natural evil. Things like the ill effects of natural events like a windstorm or fire, or moral evil by the invasion or the intrusion of other nations. And so while suffering is a major theme in the book of Job, one of the related themes is God's care for nature, God's creation of the world and God's care for creation. And Job really focuses on the forms of suffering that come as a result of living in this natural world. Terence Fretheim says this: God created a world filled with risks to human well-being, including water, the law of gravity, and wild animals. And so in this view, suffering, human suffering, is creation-based. It's part of being a created being. It's part of living in this natural world that God has provided, has created. And as we see in this book of Job, there's very little assurance that life goes on after death, right? So there's no hope in a better life after death. And the question of life after death is certainly not offered as a solution to human suffering. So it's a robust book. It's a hard book. It opens up our own thinking and our own reflection on the nature of suffering and what it means to be human and live in this world. And what is really interesting and important is that this wisdom is passed on not by propositional statements, not by proverbs like we saw in the book of Proverbs, but by dialogue, even by debate. And we'll see that this debate is really pressed forward through the dialogue between Job and his friends. It is a dialogue that is the majority of the book of Job, and we see in this dialogue, or in these dialogues, conflicting perspectives on evil and on suffering, on Job's guilt or his innocence. And so the teaching really happens through dialogue. The teaching that Job offers us really happens between this back and forth as really different perspectives on wisdom, on human suffering, are sort of going at one another. And so the book of Job, it's really important for us to understand where we're at when we're at different parts of the book of Job. It's important for us to know when are Job's friends speaking and when is Job speaking. And one of the big questions for the book of Job is whether or not this dialogue is productive. Is it simply the clashing of two or three different perspectives and there's no sort of resolution, there's no sort of growth? Or do we see some growth in the perspective of Job or his friends? In addition to these dialogues between Job and his friends, there's also near the end of the book a place where God speaks to Job and God addresses Job, and God in one form or fashion responds to the questions of Job and the lament of Job. And I think one of the key takeaways from the book of Job for us is that it represents what I would call a grown-up spirituality. The God of Job is not afraid of Job's tough questions. The God of Job is not afraid of Job's lament. And in some ways treats Job as an equal in responding to him. Now, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, the response is powerful and even brutal in some ways, but it represents a spirituality, a theology that is grown up, that is willing to wrestle with God, that is willing to wrestle with the hard questions of life and not accept easy answers. And that is a wonderful gift to us as people of faith. I want to say something briefly about the overall outline of the book of Job. Here I'm following the basic outline provided by the Common English Bible. And so the first part that I've already mentioned is the opening frame of the book of Job. So that goes from Job 1:1 through 2:13. This is also described as the prologue. This is the narrative frame. This is the once upon a time part of the story. And then in chapters 3 all the way through 37, we see these dialogues, these various dialogues between Job and his friend. You'll see on the screen that I've put up this outline, and you can see sort of how it breaks down these dialogues and when different friends are speaking. But the important thing for us to know is just to see that huge chunk of space in the book of Job that's devoted to this dialogue between Job and his friends. Then, in chapters 38 through 42, verse 6, is the dialogue between God and Job that I mentioned earlier. So it comes at the very end of this dialogue section, of this poetic section in the middle of Job, and it's between Job and God. And then in 42, verse 7 through 17, this is the epilogue, or this is the closing of the narrative frame. The once upon a time opening basically ends with, and they lived happily ever after. And one of the central questions among scholars of Job is how does this narrative frame relate to the dialogue that happens in the middle? Are these consistent? Is one meant to interpret the other? And so I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections on that. Let me turn now to just a few words about the first 10 chapters of Job, Job 1 through 10, which is the focus of our reading for this week. So, as I've said, pay attention to that narrative frame, chapter 1 and 2. This sets the stage for this character named Job. Job is a righteous person. We learn he has a wonderful family. We can imagine this is, the portraits are on the wall, and everything goes haywire for him. And so pay attention to that narrative frame. And in particular, I want to say a word about Satan, or the advocate, or the adversary rather, who is described, who is named in these first two chapters. Now, very often as Christians, when we think of Satan, we think of perhaps somebody with a pitchfork, red and fiery, or perhaps we have much more horrifying images of Satan as the embodiment of evil, as the force that is actively working against the good of God. The important thing for us to know is that in the book of Job, that's not at all how Satan was understood, or the Satan was understood. Instead, the adversary, or the Satan, is a member of God's divine counsel. We see this divine counsel throughout the Hebrew Bible, including in the Psalms. And the idea is drawn from the social and political world of the ancient Near Eastern world, that a king was, the greatness of the king was in some ways reflected by the number of people in his council, by the number of subordinate leaders who reported to him. And so the divine counsel is similar. If Yahweh is at the very top, God's sort of preeminence is supported by all of these sort of lesser known council members. And so the advocate, or the adversary, is a member of this divine council. And as we learn in the book of Job, the adversary's role is to accuse humanity before God, to call humanity to account, we might say, in front of God. And so the adversary is not evil. The adversary is not anti-God. The adversary is rather the one who is meant to keep humanity accountable to God. And we see this role in the book of Job, in these narrative frames. Another thing to point out in these first 10 chapters is obviously the friends. I would say that one of the tensions in the book of Job in these early chapters is that initially it seems like Job's friends do a great job responding to Job. They keep their mouths shut, they share in his grief and in his mourning, and they practice the ministry of presence. But then in chapter 3, they open their, or not chapter 3, but a few chapters later, they open their mouth. And that's perhaps where they begin to take some significant missteps. And so as you read these chapters, we're going to open with Job's lament in chapter 3 and 4. And then we're going to see his friends respond one at a time to what Job has said. And there's this back and forth between Job and one of his friends. And so it's important as you read to pay attention to both what Job is saying and to what his friends are saying. Let me conclude this lecture with just 3 questions to guide your reading of Job chapter 1 through 10. So the first question is sort of a personal question, a reflective question for you. And that is, how do you find yourself responding to Job's lament, to his complaint, to his assessment of what's going on in his life and how that reflects God? Does it make you uncomfortable? Does it give you freedom to voice your own lament, your own frustration? What's going on inside of you as you're reading what Job is saying? The second question is, in these first 10 chapters, what are the major differences that you see or notice between Job and his friends, especially as it relates to God and to human suffering? And finally, how do you see Job's experience, his lived experience, particularly his traumatic experience of suffering in the first two chapters of Job? How does Job's experience shape or inform or even transform his theological reflection, his understanding of God? Friends, Job is a robust and in some ways hard book, but it is one that will reward our study and our conversation. I hope this lecture has opened up Job in a helpful way, and I look forward to hearing your insights about Job. Happy reading.